will likely miss its primary budget surplus target for the year 2023 fiscal year by about 8.9 billion rand after revenue collections narrowly undershot estimates due to higher than anticipated value-added tax refunds. Africa's most industrialized economy recorded a primary budget deficit of 1.53 billion rand in the fiscal year through March 2023, the National Treasury said in an emailed response to questions citing preliminary data. The narrow miss shows that the Treasury continues to face challenges bringing revenue back in line with expenditure. Years after South Africa's public finances were weakened by an era of government graft and after the coronavirus pandemic curbed tax income and led to an increase in welfare payouts. Now, is there a way to reduce government's non-interest expenditure to plug the deficit? That is one question that will be putting across to our guest this morning. From Cape Town in South Africa, I'm being joined by Professor Roux, Professor of Economics, University of Stellenbosch Business School. It's glad to have you join us, Professor, on the show.
Thank you. Good morning to you. Good morning to all your listeners and viewers, and thanks for the invitation.
Now, by about 8.9 billion rand in deficit difference, how do you think that the South African government shot itself in the foot? Because some have said that the VAT projections were overbooked and they were overrated. What's your take?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, let's just think about what we're talking about here, the government's fiscal situation, which has become an Achilles heel for quite some time. And we had reached a point over the last couple of years where, unfortunately, some part of the money being borrowed each year by government was being used to pay interest on previously incurred government debt. So when the minister a year ago forecast that for the 22-23 fiscal year, that excluding interest, there might be a small surplus, that was, of course, very good news. It would have meant we're no longer in that cycle of borrowing money to pay interest. Unfortunately, the latest figures, the estimates that have come out, indicate that we haven't quite reached that target, that indeed a small part of the additional borrowings for the 22 fiscal year will have to go towards paying back that interest. And that is typically what you don't want. That is indicative of approaching a so-called debt trap. But must bear in mind, we're talking about a year that has come and gone. Although these are preliminary estimates, they're probably pretty close to where we're going to end up for the past year. So maybe we need to say, okay, that was unfortunate, the result of a number of factors, as you pointed out in your introduction, the result of higher than expected VAT refunds, the result of ongoing demands by civil servants for higher wages, so the wage bills getting higher and higher, the result of naturally a very sluggish economy, so the tax base is not able to grow organically, and the result of other demands in the fiscus which are perfectly understandable, such as social grants. Those things are not going to go away. So looking forward, and we can't do much about what's happened historically, we can only really talk about what lies ahead for the coming year. Again, looking at the minister's estimates that came out in the February budget speech, he had been budgeting for again a primary surplus. It's not impossible in the year that lies ahead, but it will depend very heavily on the points I've made already. And unfortunately, if anything, economic growth in the year ahead will be even slower and lower than the last year, which means that the tax base cannot grow organically. At the same time, in the budget speech, he was quite generous from a taxpayer's point of view, very little increase in actual tax rates, which is telling us that the revenue from taxes will probably not come to our rescue. That leaves the spending side. And even since February, things have changed in the sense that in his estimates of expenditure in February, he made the assumption that civil servant wages or the wage bill would rise by only a couple of percentage points. Already, that has been lifted to 4.5%, which means the civil service wage bill, which makes up a big chunk of budget spending, is going to be higher than anticipated. If we also consider social grants, well, at the risk of getting slightly political here, we cannot see these being taken away within the next year. because next year this country, as you probably know, is going to have a national election. It would be rather politically imprudent to take away social grants on the eve of a recession.
So, Professor, even as you continue with your analytics now, does it mean that the country's fiscal position is in a precariously fragile state? Because you talked about the fact that South Africa is trying as much as possible to ensure that the debt payment continues and also to avoid a debt trap. But then we are seeing that it is incurring budget deficits to the tune of 1.53 billion. And of course, from other estimates, looking at the preliminary data, it shows that main budget deficits of about 310 billion rand, or from 4.7% of the GDP, is also being incurred. So when you have these fiscal gaps, so what does it say about the country's fiscal position?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm leading up to. So the chances of us having a primary budget surplus in the year that lies ahead, I think, are slimmer than before. And the chances of the total government debt rising to a higher level than initially projected are stronger than before. And if we go back to, yes, I can see some numbers on the screen right now. If we go back to the February budget, the minister made the assumption that the government debt would peak in about 3 or 4 years' time at around about 75%. One suspects it might take longer to peak, and it could peak at a higher level than 75, 76%, which is not the end of the world. I mean, many countries, including big, well-known developed countries, have even higher levels of government debt. The problem is, the real concern is that a large chunk of this debt over the last 10 years or more has been incurred to finance current spending and not, as one would have hoped, capital spending. So it's kind of unproductive debt that we're talking about. And that, I think, is where the real concern lies. But just one more point at this stage. This means that the scope for the government in the years that lie ahead to apply an expansionary fiscal policy is extremely limited. It would be very rash to be deliberately expansionary and thereby balloon the government debt. And that's unfortunate, because for a country on the verge of a recession, you would have liked to have seen government actually coming to the party by spending more than usual and taxing less. It just can't do that. So one of the reasons for the constraint on our future economic growth prospects is past, let's say, unfortunate, irrational, not well thought out fiscal decisions which are now catching up with us.
All right. Now, some people have actually pinned this particular situation on past administrations and, of course, the current administration, because there have been issues or allegations around government graft, and there have been issues about government expenditure that have not been accounted for, or expenditures that have not been done in the right way. And people are saying that governments or administrations have not done well in this area, and that is also resulting to a weakened economy as we speak. So do you also align with that thought?
Yes, I think certainly it plays a role. To try to calculate the exact nature and extent of the role is rather difficult, and not only because there might be a direct impact, but also indirect impact. What I mean by that is this whole suspicion, perception that corruption is alive and well does, of course, not create a very pretty picture for potential investors. So indirectly, regardless of the extent of this apparent, let's say, corruption and graft, it is also having a potential negative impact, because foreign investors and even local investors might become more and more reluctant to invest in a country which has this image, however true or false the image might be, of potential corruption, mismanagement, inappropriate departmental leadership, etc. Of course, what the other elephant in the room, as you mentioned in your news broadcast, is, of course, Eskom, electricity, load shedding, as we call it. And even at the current level of load shedding, it is argued that it shaves off up to 2% of the country's potential economic growth. So the combination of that, along with the precarious fiscal situation, along with the low economic growth prospects, along with the perception of unfortunate graft, etc., does not create, as I say, a very rosy, pretty picture for investors, both local and abroad, which becomes a vicious cycle because that in turn suppresses to some extent the potential of the economy to grow.
All right, so in this fiscal year, are we likely to see that the government continues to struggle in terms of balancing the books between expenditure and revenue generated? And I'm sure South Africans also continue to expect an unstable economy, because if it is hard for the government to balance these books and meet up with its debt payments and also have a stable economy, it will not all go well for businesses, both in the formal and the informal sector.
Yeah. Well, as I pointed out, yes, I think it's going to be difficult in the coming year to reach all the targets because on both the spending and the revenue side, there are problems. On the spending side, as I mentioned, the government wage bill is going to be higher than they thought back in February. On the revenue side, because as I mentioned, the sluggish economic growth, the tax base is hardly going to grow at all. I suppose in a strange way, you mentioned having a stable economy. In a strange way, we are starting to experience stability in mediocrity. So nothing really comes as a big surprise. Nothing that we read about or anticipate is really going to be a surprise. Economic growth prospects for the year ahead lie between 0.3%. The highest forecast, I think, at the moment is 0.9%. So whatever the growth is going to be, 0.3, 0.5, 0.6, as I say, in a strange way, it won't be a big surprise. It's going to be disappointingly low. It's not going to frighten people. It's going to disappoint people. It's not going to frighten people. It's not going to come, as I say, as an unexpected, unfortunate situation. It'll be more surprising if we do grow at more than 1% in the coming year, but that'll be a pleasant surprise. So stability, stable economy, as I say, oddly, perversely, there is stability in our mediocrity.
All right, so in order to now plug this primary surplus shortfall, what leadership skills or leadership initiatives do you think that the South African government can bring on board to salvage the situation, as the case may be?
Yeah, well, I suppose, first of all, there's not much one could do with the best one in the world within a few months or within a year. But looking beyond just the next couple of years, I think we know some of the requirements are, it's not just up to leadership, by the way, not just up to political leadership. I think far too often we lay all the blame as well as all the expectations on government. It's a joint effort. But certainly we have to go back to some basics. We need to see, and it's easier said than done, that government spending needs to be reined in. That doesn't mean necessarily has to be lowered, but increases need to be no higher than inflation. And that takes a strong political will, because, as I mentioned earlier, with an election coming up in a year's time, it's rather difficult politically and even perhaps rash, foolish, to take money away from people. But it has to come sooner or later, sooner rather than later. Obviously, we mentioned a bit earlier, corruption and the like. One would hope that as the weeks and the months and the years go by, that we will restore what used to be one of our biggest strengths. I'm talking about the late 1990s, early 2000s, namely that most of our institutions were autonomous, were well-led, and were doing a good job. And that becomes a very important requirement for any country when it comes to growth and development. So hopefully we will get some kind of renaissance regarding our institutional integrity and potential. That won't happen overnight, but it's certainly not impossible. Then another well-known, almost economics 101 requirement is obviously in the longer term having sufficient savings, sufficient national savings by both the corporate and the household and the government sector. Because as we know, savings are crucial to require fixed investment, such as infrastructure, which in turn is crucial for future economic growth. Other basic requirements, of course, are education and training, making sure, and this is a long-term project, but making sure that our young population, and that's something that all countries in Africa have in common, a young population, which is potentially positive in the sense of a demographic dividend, but only if that young population is appropriately and properly educated and trained. As I say, it's a long-term project, but it's a key requirement. And in all of these things, leadership And I want to stress again, not just political leadership, corporate leadership, civil leadership has a very important role to play. But at the risk of using too many cliches, Rome wasn't built in a day. You cannot undo many of these, let's say, warped areas of spending. You can't undo that overnight. It takes a while to put that into place. And that's a lesson I think that this country and many other countries in Africa need to take to heart. There's no quick fix. It takes 5, 10, well, not 5 is too short, 10, 15, 20 years before we can really start turning things around.
Well, I must say, Professor, that 20 years is a lot of time to consider when you're talking about a positive turnaround. But then, let me just quickly chip in the issue of micro enterprises who have to live through staying afloat, ensuring that they stay afloat in terms of the cost of operation. They have to pay more for that. They have to pay taxes. They have to live through a fluctuating currency. And they also have to ensure that they're able to sustain the operations and sustain their job and the workers. So do you think that they should also get a tax rebate?
Personally, yes, I do. I mean, we say, and we've been saying for a long, long time, again, not just here, but all over the world, but especially in Africa, that part of the future is things such as self-employment. Gone are the days where big businesses employ many people and create many jobs. It'll happen here and there. But the fastest growing kind of employment is self-employment, and that comes via micro-enterprise. But you're quite right. Throughout the length and breadth of Africa, life for a micro-enterprise, especially a budding, nascent one, is extremely difficult, ranging from being able or not being able to borrow seed money, or only being able to do so at exceptionally high rates of interest, having to comply with all kinds of rules and regulations. In South Africa, as you're pointing out, having to deal with constant loss of electricity. So yes, I would certainly believe we need to put our money where our mouths are and provide any kind of rebate, any kind of incentive for small businesses to establish themselves, but more importantly, to survive the first couple of years. So yes, I would be a big fan of that.
All right.
Whether that's audible is a different question.
All right, thank you very much. That's another question for some other day, but then we appreciate you joining us on the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, the 2023 budget had been designed to address South Africa's immediate needs, but this news of missing its primary budget surplus suggests that more work may need to be done to ensure that the country's long-term financial stability is achieved. Let's quickly go on a short break. When we return, it'll be time for international business stories.